Learning about exposure and how to use it is an exciting step towards becoming a great photographer. You can't begin to understand how much freedom exposure gives you until you take your camera off automatic. Once you have done this, I guarantee it will transform your photography. You'll be able to take pictures in almost any light, capture time at any speed, and even decide how much of your image you want to be in focus. So here's what you need to know. In photography, exposure is the amount of light that passes through your lens and hits your digital sensor or film to record an image. Two components create exposure, and these are shutter speed and aperture. Your aperture controls the mass of light that enters your camera, and your shutter speed governs the length of time the light is allowed to pass through. There is also a third setting called camera ISO. This has no creative value, but purely controls the light sensitivity of the sensor or film that the light hits to capture your image. I will talk in more detail about using different apertures and shutter speeds in our creative exposure lesson. But for now, I'm going to concentrate on the relationship between your shutter speed, aperture and ISO. Don't skip this, because you do need to understand this information before moving to the next level. So let's start with shutter speeds. Your shutter speed controls the length of your exposure. This can now be anything from 32,000th of a second to actually the world record was set by a German artist who had an exposure of 4 years and 8 months. In this case, he used a beer can lined with photographic paper as a pinhole camera. So how do shutter speeds work? I'm showing you an old-fashioned shutter speed dial because it's got numbers on it. These are the same ones we use today, and I want you to recognise a pattern. If you look at the dial, you'll notice that each number is either double or half of the number next to it. This is important. Exposure is all about doubling or halving quantities of light. Whether we are talking about shutter speeds, aperture or ISO, they all use the same principle. If you've heard photographers talk about opening up or +1 stop, they've just let in double the amount of light than they did on their previous exposure. Alternatively, if they've closed down or -1 stop, they've reduced the amount of light entering the camera by half. Let me give you an example. If I were to take a photograph with a shutter speed of half a second, but the exposure looks a bit dark, I need to allow more time for light to pass into my camera to brighten my image. All I do is select the next number in the sequence, which is slower than the one currently set. In this case, it's 1 second. At 1 second, the shutter remains open for twice as long as half a second. So double the amount of light will enter my camera, and I increase my exposure by +1 stop. Another example. If I take a photograph with a shutter speed of 2/50th of a second, but this time the image is a little bright, I want to reduce the amount of light coming in. To do this, I choose the next fastest shutter speed on the dial, which is 500th of a second. My shutter now stays open half as long as it did at 2/50th, so only half the amount of light can enter my camera and my image becomes darker. This time, because I have reduced the light, I have decreased my exposure by -1 stop. There's probably a lot of you watching that are saying, what about half stop or third stop exposure changes? And you are right. Sometimes altering exposure by doubling or halving is too much, so smaller increments of speed and aperture are available. But for now, I'm keeping it simple because I want to explain exposure in easy terms. If you're still finding it all a bit confusing, don't worry, I will keep going over it and it will click in. So to recap, when deciding on an exposure, your shutter speed controls the amount of time you allow light to enter your camera, and you can increase or decrease this by changing your shutter speed to allow more or less light in. Now, let's move on to our aperture. Throughout this course, I will be talking about aperture and f-numbers, but they mean the same thing. So what is aperture? Aperture is an adjustable iris in the camera lens that lets light through. We know that our shutter speed is responsible for controlling the amount of time that light is allowed to pass into the camera, but now the size of our aperture controls the quantity of light that passes through. We can choose the size of our iris by selecting one of a series of f numbers. They're not as straightforward as our shutter speed numbers, but that's because they are fractions, and this is why the smaller numbers let in more light. For example, f4 you could see as a quarter, which is a bigger share than f16 or a 16th. They work in exactly the same way as our shutter speed numbers, in as much as each f number lets in either double or half as much light as the number next to it. For example, if I shot an image at f5.6 and it looked a little dark and I wanted to make it brighter using my aperture, I select the next f number that will allow a bigger quantity of light to enter my camera. This is f4, which will let double the amount of light in, so I brighten my exposure by +1 stop. Alternatively, if I shot the same image at f5.6, but this time it's too bright, I choose the next f number, which reduces the amount of light that enters my lens. This is f8, which cuts the amount of light by half, so in this situation, I am reducing my exposure by -a stop. As I mentioned, I will be talking about the advantages of different f numbers in the creative exposure lesson. But for now, think of your aperture as working very much like your own eye. To focus, our eyes require a certain amount of light, and we regulate how much light enters our retina by changing our pupil size. In low light, our pupils become large to allow a lot of light in. If we're taking a photograph at that time, our camera will need a lot of light too, so to achieve this, we select an f number with a big dimension, for example, f2.8 or f4. Alternatively, on a bright day, our pupils become small to limit the amount of light entering our eye. So if we're shooting at midday, we'll also need to reduce the amount of light entering the camera. This time, we choose an f number that hardly lets any light in at all, which is f16 or f22. Think how it hurts your eye at night if someone points a torch in your direction. It's because your pupil was large and it suddenly let in too much light. That's a good lesson on exposure, as it's the same principle as overexposing an image. To capture an image, your camera needs a lens to focus the light and a digital sensor or film to record your photograph. The camera needs a certain amount of light to produce a good photograph, but you will be shooting in many different lighting conditions and using a whole variety of combinations of shutter speeds and f numbers. So how do we make sure we get our shot? To help us, our camera also has a series of ISO numbers. These don't have any creative qualities, they only change the light sensitivity of the sensor which is capturing your image. In simple terms, your shutter speed and aperture exposure remain exactly the same, but if you're shooting in low light, you can choose an ISO number that will make your image brighter, or if there's too much available light, you can instead select an ISO which will darken your image. As with your aperture and shutter speeds, each number is either double or half of the number next to it. For example, if you increase your ISO from 100 to 200, your sensor will now have double the sensitivity, so your image will look twice as bright, and you've increased your exposure by +1 stop. And as I'm sure you've guessed, if you reduce your speed from 800 to 400, your photo will be half as bright or -a stop. It's always better to photograph with as low an ISO as you can. This is between 100 to 400, because by increasing your sensor sensitivity, unfortunately you will lose some of your image quality. At about 800 ISO, you will start to notice your image becoming increasingly grainy and pixels will begin to show. It's a matter of weighing up how important that is to you, but I would do some experimenting with it. To help you while you get familiar with ISO speeds, here are my suggested settings. Finally, if you are shooting digitally, you can change your ISO as often as you want. However, if you are shooting on film, you must set your camera to the same ISO setting and don't change it until you have finished shooting the whole roll. You can't ignore ISO if you're a photographer. It's too valuable an asset. Learn how to set it on your camera, and if you're using your mobile, turn off your flash and it will set automatically. Put your camera on manual, and I'd like you to practice taking photographs outside and inside. Don't use flash even if you have it. And it doesn't matter what you photograph, this is just about getting well-exposed images. Here are some settings to get you started, and you can adjust them until you are happy with your exposure. Remember, you can change your ISO, shutter speed or aperture to adjust your image, so play around with all of them until they become familiar to you. When you're practiced, you won't even think about it anymore. It will be instinctive. That's our goal.